Let's break down our week 4 must-start defenses and streams. These are the defenses that are going to help you guys absolutely dominate your league mates as we approach week 4 of the fantasy season. We're going to kick the video off with the Denver Broncos, who will have a home game matchup against the Bengals. Finished week 3 with 10 fantasy points, allowed 23 total points, 5 sacks, a forced fumble, an interception, gave up 376 total yards to the Chargers. And this wasn't exactly like their best defensive performance, but you got to feel great about the fact that they came through with 10 fantasy points, especially after they gave you a goose egg 0 fantasy points in week 2 and got dropped from a lot of rosters. I was really surprised to see this across the few leagues that I play in that do have a defensive special team spots. Like, people just giving up on the Broncos. So they do sit around 88% rostered if they're out there and available. It wasn't like a super great matchup in week 3 on the road against a good Chargers offense. But if they're out there and available, they are a priority, must add and must start defense. They still have double-digit fantasy performances in 2 out of the first 3 games on the season. They're at home in week 4. They're going up against a completely derailed Bengals team here in week 3. Jake Browning has 5 interceptions in the last 2 weeks. This is a quarterback who we're going to actively be looking to stream against. The Minnesota Vikings defense that we talked about in last week's video just had an absolutely astronomical day against the Bengals in week 3. You have to go out, grab the Broncos if they're available. If you own them, you absolutely cannot bench them. I know this might feel like an obvious one, but I'm telling you guys, a lot of people did somewhat give up on the Broncos or drop them because of the week 3 matchup after they gave up a goose egg to Danny Dimes in week 2. So this is still one of the very best defenses in the NFL. They're in a smash spot at home in week 4. They're an absolute lock for a must-start defense as we approach the week. And I mentioned we talked about the Vikings in last week's video, and of course we're going to talk about the Vikings again in week 4 as they are coming off a game where they had 35 fantasy points, only allowed 10 points to the Bengals. They had 4 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, 2 interceptions, and 2 defensive touchdowns. This may have been one of the best overall defensive scoring days for fantasy that we'll see all season long. Now, I do want to talk about this matchup against the Steelers. I like it. I think it's good enough, but I will say this is our first international game of the season, and these international games always get a little weird. Like, I feel like we always either see a lot of offense or a lot of defense, never really anything in between, but what we do know is that Aaron Rodgers has 3 interceptions in his last 2 games, and this isn't a home game for either team, right? But it feels like the Vikings have played in more of these international games. It feels like they play one every single year. I mean, that might actually be the case. And ultimately, I feel like the Vikings defense always shows up in these international games. So don't make your decision based on that or anything, but I just feel like this is a good spot for the Vikings. And I mean, I will kind of mention, like, they weren't necessarily great through the first 2 weeks of the season, but they have had a turnover in every game and 2 or more sacks in every game so far. Like I said, we know that the turnover potential is there with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. So they're coming off of a huge day. I think they will shoot up a little bit in roster percentage, already sitting at 80% rostered, but they're out there and available. You don't have anything better. I think that they are a strong option once again in week 4. Except I want to talk about the Buffalo Bills, who I had in last week's video, and they did not show up for us. Just 2 fantasy points on Thursday Night Football against the Dolphins. They had an interception that capped the game off, but outside of that, gave up 276 total yards and 21 total points and did nothing else. And they sit around 86% rostered. I could see them getting dropped in a lot of leagues just because they've kind of been, fluctuating to start the year. 2 fantasy points, 13 fantasy points, then 2 fantasy points like we just discussed. But they're at home in week 4 against Spencer Rattler and the Saints. And I really like this spot for the Bills defense as Spencer Rattler threw an interception this past week. I think we could all easily say this was the worst offensive performance from the Saints so far on the season on the the road against Seattle. And this is just a tough place for a young quarterback like Spencer Rattler to come into, to travel to Buffalo, tough environment to play in, all of that. So I think that the Bills are one of these teams that are a bit matchup dependent when it comes to, defensive special teams and fantasy scoring. And I thought they would be in a better spot in week 3. They did not show up for you guys, but if you own them, don't panic. Think that they are a solid start with a safe floor in week 4, and they have a lot of upside due to the fact that they're playing the Saints as we approach the week. And another team that we talked about last week that I think has been quietly really good to start the year is the Jacksonville Jaguars. 13 fantasy points in week 13, gave up 10 total points to the Texans, 2 sacks, a forced fumble recovery, and 2 interceptions. They now have 2 or more interceptions in every single game this year. They have a forced fumble in 2 out of the first 3 games on the year, and they sit at just 5% rostered. Like I said, this defense has been quietly really strong to start the year. They haven't necessarily faced the toughest of opponents with Bryce Young, mostly Jake Browning in week 2, then CJ Stroud and the Texans, who look absolutely porous. And, I think that the big thing to look at in week 4 is that if they do end up facing Mac Jones at quarterback, obviously we like that matchup a lot more. He didn't look as great in week 3 compared to week 2, where he threw for 3 touchdowns. This past week just threw 1 touchdown and 1 interception. He looked okay, don't get me wrong, but he also got a little bit banged up in this matchup. So, I don't exactly know who's going to be starting at quarterback in this matchup for the 49ers. Brock Purdy could be back. Mac Jones could be out there. Maybe somebody else is out there. But, obviously we like him more if it's a backup quarterback situation. But if it's not, I still think that the Jaguars, call me crazy, are a solid option because his defense has been really stout and they're just really lowly rostered. I do think most people will look at this matchup, Purdy's a quarterback and not trust the Jags defense. So if you're in a pickle towards the end of the week, you need somebody to pick up, or a team to pick up, I should say. They're very lowly rostered. You can pick them up and plug them in. But guys, keep your eyes peeled. If we get another week of Mac Jones or a backup quarterback, I think that the Jags are a really strong option in week 4. So let's talk about the Washington Commanders, coming off of a day where they had 11 total fantasy points, 5 total sacks. Didn't really do a whole lot in this game outside of getting sacks, but I think they're in a really good spot in week 4. And don't forget, this is a team that had 10 fantasy points in week 1 as well. Didn't do so great in week 2 against the Packers, but 11 fantasy points this past week, so they have had double-digit fantasy performances in 2 out of the first 3 games of the season. And now they are going on the road to face the Falcons and Michael Penix, who's coming off of a very porous performance. After having a very poor performance in week 2, 2 interceptions this past week against the Panthers, the Falcons didn't do anything offensively in week 3. This is a great spot for the Commanders defense. The quarterback play has looked awful for the Falcons. Raheem Morris has already come out and said that Michael Penix is going to be the starter in week 4. They're not going to give Kirk Cousins a chance to come in or anything, which be fun to see Cousins play against the Commanders, one of his former teams. But nonetheless, here, we know this is a good spot for the Commanders. Going up against what has been really, really bad quarterback play the past 2 weeks out of Michael Penix. So they sit at 43% rostered. This is one of my favorite streaming options as we approach week 4 of the season. All right, last but not least, I do want to mention the LA Chargers, coming off of a pretty porous day, just 2 fantasy points in week 3. They sit around 9% rostered, but I do think the Chargers are a defense to pay attention to. They're going to get the New York Giants here in week 4 on the road, and I am recording this before Sunday Night Football. So maybe Dangerous has another really, really big game like he did in week 2 against the Cowboys, and maybe don't feel as good. We'll see as time tells here, but we do know Russell Wilson didn't play great whatsoever in week 1. Still threw an interception in week 2, and I would just still argue that this is a decent enough spot to consider the Chargers in week 4. But I also think that when you look at the Chargers' upcoming schedule, they have some nice areas. Week 5 against Washington, maybe Mariota's out there. I would assume it's JD5, but maybe we get Mariota. Week 6, they get Tua and the Dolphins. Week 7, they get Danny Dimes. Okay, I guess we can't stream against Danny Dimes, but maybe by that time, Danny Dimes' Indiana Jones magic has worn off. I don't know. Then week 8, they get whoever's the starting quarterback for the Vikings is. Then they're going to get Cam Ward in week 9. Then they're going to get Aaron Rodgers. Then they're going to get Trevor Lawrence a bye week. And then they're going to get Geno Smith. So they do have a lot of nice opportunity over the next couple of weeks. We like them going into week 2 as a streaming option. They had 13 fantasy points. So they may be a bit matchup dependent, but I do think that just in general, they are a defense to pay attention to because like we saw in week 2, in the right spots and opportunities, they will definitely show up for you guys. So maybe base this one for week 4 based on how the matchup between the Chiefs and the Giants goes. But I still think that the Chargers, very lowly rostered, could be a streaming option for you guys in week 4. All right, very quickly here, let's run through the rest of the schedule in case you guys are wondering why I didn't talk about any specific team here. Just kick things off, Thursday Night Football, we do have the Seahawks-Cardinals. If you guys own the Seahawks, you want to roll with them, I'm all for it. I think that they're still a strong start. They sit at 79% rostered. They've had double digits in 2 of the first 3 games, 7 fantasy points in week 1. I just hate Thursday Night Football. I know that I put a Thursday night team in the video last week in the Bills, but generally I try to stay away from Thursday Night Football, but the Seahawks still a strong option, not like Kyler Murray's necessarily lighting things up. So if you want to roll with the Seahawks, I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. Then we look a little bit further here. Titans, Texans, nothing there for me that we want to pay attention to. Eagles, Bucks, come on. I mean, we're going to get too much offense in that game. No, the Panthers just had a big day. They're on the road against the Patriots. Once again, I just don't trust them whatsoever. Browns, Lions, just nothing there for me once again. Colts, Rams, I do think is interesting. I was close to putting the Colts defense in the video. We had them in the video going into week 3. They had 14 fantasy points in week 3. They also had 14 in week 1, a dud in week 2. I just don't really trust them on the road against a Rams offense that just had a really good day against the Eagles. So they are intriguing. They are one of these teams that if you are in a really, really bad spot, there's nothing out there, they might be available for you and they could maybe do something, but I don't know that I trust them against the Rams. Then we have the Bears, Raiders. The Bears are kind of interesting because they had 11 fantasy points in both week 1 and week 3, a complete dud in week 2 with negative fantasy points, and they get Geno Smith this week, who you never know what you're going to get out of. The Bears, maybe a desperation option. They're sitting at 3% rostered, but once again, I don't know that I necessarily trust them. Ravens, Chiefs, no thank you. Too much offense potentially there. Packers, Cowboys, I still think you can start the Packers. They're solid enough. I know they let us down against the Browns with just 8 fantasy points. They're on the road here against the Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb's, kind of a question mark going into the week after he sustained an injury. So I still think the Packers are solid. Revenge game for Micah Parsons. You got to like the narrative on Sunday Night Football. So if you own the Packers, I think you're good here, but maybe the upside's a little bit limited here. Jets, Dolphins, come on, there's nothing there for you guys, and that really wraps up the schedule for week 4. So there's the rest of the breakdown. I will say Seahawks, if you own them, like I said, feel good about that. Maybe there's something for the Colts. Maybe there's something for the Bears. And if you own the Packers, I'm still good with them as we approach week 4 of the season. There you guys have it. There are my must-start defenses and streams as we move into week 4 of the fantasy season. If you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, make sure you guys drop them in the comments down below. I will answer as many comments as I possibly can throughout the course of the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor if you guys hit that subscribe button on the way out. And when the playlists and videos pop up on the screen, don't forget, guys, we're going to have everything you could possibly need here on the channel as we approach week 4 of the season. So make sure you guys are checking out all of the videos as the week progresses. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.